Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm going to offer something that I hope is going to be somewhere between the first and the second presentation that we've heard. So this will be slightly different. I'm Liam Byrne, so I'm a Member of Parliament. I serve the poorest community in Britain, in Hodge Hill, in East Birmingham, and I was Chief Secretary in the last Labour government. And today I chair Parliament's cross-party think tank on inclusive growth. And I've just finished a history of the British economy told through the lives of 10 of our greatest entrepreneurs, and that's where I want to start, because my favourite story in the book is about two Brummies, where I'm from, Matthew Bolton and James Watt, the dynamic duo of the Industrial Revolution, and their arrival on the London scene really comes in a big way in 1786 when they build the first steam-powered mill down in Southwark. And this is like nothing anyone has ever seen before. It's steam driven from top to bottom. It's so big and so powerful it knocks 2 shillings off the price of a bag of flour almost overnight. And it does good business for about 4 or 5 years until one dark evening in 1791. Flames are observed, and over the course of the night the mill is burnt down. And there, dancing in the firelight, are the millers of Southwark who had lost their businesses when the mill had opened, waving signs saying no to Albion Mill but yes to Albion. And of course this was the beginning of about 40 or 50 years of British history, through to the Luddites in 1811, 1813, through to the Captain Swing riots of 1830, through to the birth of Chartism and then the trade unions, which was, in upsum, a movement to try and restore the norms of the moral economy as the forces of the market economy were breaking through. And so if you read E.P. Thompson and Hobsbawm, they would argue that this first torching of the Albion Mill, Luddites, Captain Swing, was simply about trying to defend the norms of the medieval economy: just price, just wage, restrictions on usury, in the face of gigantic market forces that were breaking through. And the point of the story, and the relevance of the story today, is that over the last 300 or 400 years, working people in Britain have always found a way of defending what they see as their core economic interests. And that's why they voted for Brexit. And so when you look at the relationship between parts of our country which are poorer, overwhelmingly they voted for Brexit. If you look at the parts of the United States that voted for President Trump, overwhelmingly they're poorer. They're older, they're characterised by lower education levels, and crucially they are much more pessimistic about the whys and wherefores of their economic future. And so the core challenge for economic policymakers today is that voters no longer smash up machines, they're now voting to smash up trade treaties. So this kind of democratic Luddism is not actually anti-machine, it's not actually anti-automation, it's not anti-future. It is a cry of rage, if you like, to preserve their fair share of the economic settlement. The challenge that I see now, I suppose, looking back, and I should say that I'm a kind of recovering Blairite, so I was very much in the vanguard of third way politics in the 90s and the early noughties. Now looking back with some pain and honesty on a lot of the mistakes that we made. And I think at the core of where we began to go wrong was simply not to observe the changing relationships, the symbiotic relationships between firm and state. So since the age of exploration, we've found ways of really harmonising that relationship, from mercantilism to imperialism to the economic settlement that Barry described so eloquently. And the third way basically tried to double down on a political economy of trade, tech and tax. So we thought that if we could encourage trade, if we could encourage tech, we could basically create an economic sum, an economic upside that we could tax and redistribute in order to ensure that all boats floated. And that began to go wrong for 3 very significant reasons. First, the firm's power to look after the business of distribution, or what folks like Jacob Hacker call pre-distribution, came under sustained pressure through shareholder value, which began to punish in the market firms which were simply not maximising their returns to shareholders rather than distributing a more even spread between the various stakeholders of the firms. Second, the financial crash and then the austerity that followed significantly challenged the state's ability to look after redistribution. And so if you look at, for example, the amount of money that we now spend on tertiary education, it's one of the lowest in the OECD, about 0.6% of GDP. If you look at the budget cuts that have been delivered to regional policy, local government settlements, for example, they have been at the sharp end of the cuts. And so our ability to tax the gains of trade and redistribute them fairly have been fiscally comprehensively undermined by the strategy of austerity over the last 10 years. What has then challenged both the mechanisms of distribution and redistribution has, however, been the revolution in market power. And so writers like Peter Nolan were writing about global consolidation many, many years ago, but the $20 trillion M&A wave that we've seen since the mid to late 90s does now mean that the commanding heights of the global economy are now completely concentrated in a way that they were 20 or 30 years ago. And you can now see in the literature some of the consequences of this. So writers like Jason Furman have been talking about the challenge of monopsony for some time. There's the newer paper from DeLoca and Eckhart on the exponential rise in markups. The literature in the United States on the rise of market power and the dangers of market power is now quite well developed. So I think the IMF is about to publish some work that will look at this, some of the statistics for Europe, which are not as pronounced as America, but nonetheless reveal the same kind of trends. So when you have these big firms that have got real power to both hold down wages, push up prices, and crucially avoid tax, you've got significant problems for firms' abilities to distribute gains by connecting people with good jobs and firms' ability to redistribute in order to restore a measure of equality. So I suspect that that will be amongst the areas that you look at. It's going to be a complicated picture to restore, but I am one of those people that believe that finding new ways to push forward trade remains important. I don't think, and we're at danger of this in Westminster at the moment, we are very, very focused on the politics of redistribution, and so arguments in politics come down, very often today, not to specific policy solutions versus other policy solutions. They do tend now to be reduced to a simple question of whose side are you on, and that is what you get, I think, when the politics of redistribution dominates political life. We have to attend to that, but over and above that, we have got to, I think, renew our arguments about the economics and the politics of growth too. And trade, therefore, will remain very important. Now, I think a bit like our last two speakers, I am quite pessimistic about the potential for grand bargains driving forward trade growth in the future in the way that we saw with NAFTA, the doubling of the size of the EU, the admission of China to the WTO. I think we're through for some time now the era of grand bargains, and I think the challenge that we're going to see now in global institutions, whether that's the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank or the United Nations, is basically the clash of two manifest destinies. So on the one hand, you will see the Trump ethos of make America great again, but on the other, you will see President Xi's community of common interest, I think, depending on how you translate it. Those are two very contrasting worldviews, and they're going to bang into each other with increasing degrees of friction in global institutions. And what you can now see with China, that Chinese leadership through the CCP's dialogue with the world that they hold in Chongqing sort of in October, November time, is you can now see China acting as a champion for SDGs. China championed the language around inclusive growth at the Hangzhou G20, and you can see China now beginning to build a coalition of interest amongst the developing world in particular around that agenda. So China is now moving into an era of agenda setting and coalition building in a way that has not been seen since modern China was created. So I'm sort of quite pessimistic as to how much is actually going to be resolved in the arena of global institutions. So what do optimists do then? You have to be an optimist in my business. What do you do to try and make progress happen? Well, the rules-based international order is a very useful rubric. It was an accidental phrase that emerged after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not been unpacked by British ministers. I think the The extent to which it's been unpacked is about 3 paragraphs in the Prime Minister's last Chatham House speech. But it is actually a very useful reminder that down the centuries, economic integration is driven by institutions. We're very good at institution building in this country. We've been doing it for a long time. Institutions are built around rules. I think that there are probably 7 sets of rules, 7 sets of institutions which wise policymakers can begin to roll out, and I would argue the priority for their rollout is across Eurasia. That's partly because that's where the money is. You know, by 2030, the main economies of the Silk Road will be 2 or 3 times the size of the main economies along the Atlantic seaboard, and therefore that is probably going to assume a level of economic priority. But here are the kind of 7 holes that I see in today's debate. The first is around infrastructure. So at the end of the Second World War, we had the Marshall Plan, but we also had the creation of new international institutions like the OSCE, which tried to do a bit of a coordination job in beginning to help aim where investment in infrastructure rebuilding tended to go. We have nothing like that across One Belt, One Road. So we don't have a sense of what is the most trade-enhancing investment in infrastructure that we could make. Is it to rebuild the Baltic ports? Is it to build pipelines from the Gulf to China? Is it digital networks? We just don't know what is the most significant trade-enhancing infrastructure along One Belt, One Road. We don't know either the terms on which that infrastructure should be built. So we've now seen enough of Chinese railway building in Africa or Qatari stadium building in the Gulf to know that we lack good global transparent rules for how infrastructure can be built safely, securely, and in a way that fosters inclusive growth. Second, I don't think we have good global standards for infrastructure finance. So in the years after 1825, Nathan Rothschild and his friends built a great capital market here in London, helping create the financial market for the industrialisation of Europe. There were simple standards for how these bonds floated, the covenants attached to them, the level of transparency, the forms of redress. We don't have those sort of standards at the moment for the way infrastructure finance flows into One Belt, One Road projects. In fact, one of the things that's holding back the UK signing a Belt and Road deal with China is an argument about what are the standards that we should attach to that deal. What are the standards around avoiding high indebted countries, for example? Where is the dispute resolution going to take place? We don't have some basic standards and settlement procedures yet agreed with China. The third thing we've got to get our head around is the fiscal strategy. What's the strategy for tariffs and tax across One Belt, One Road? We kind of think that we should be trying to keep tariffs low to exploit and give a boost to trade, but how do we make sure we get a tax yield from this that we can then redistribute? How do we make sure that taxes aren't hidden in tax havens? How do we make sure there's good coordination of tax policy across that trade zone? Fourth is around security and checks on piracy. Obviously, the countries where conflict is very sharp and where IDP numbers are very high are along they're in the middle of One Belt, One Road. There's no coordinated security policy in the way that once upon a time we had the Royal Navy to keep the sea lanes safe. Fifth, there are no really good views, I think, about dispute resolution. So China is setting up 2 or 3 One Belt, One Road dispute resolution procedure hubs in China. Actually, one of the things I'm most excited about with the Great Britain-China Centre, when I sit on the board, is the work that we're doing with China's judiciary. We're developing common law training systems for the way in which we can collaborate around law cases in intellectual property and in internet cases in particular. There's then, and that is connected to questions about how we ensure data flows. Data is a critical enabler of services economies. 2/3, 3/4 or so of our exports to Europe are data enabled. Are there good data sharing regimes across the One Belt, One Road trade hub? And finally, financial flows. We know that China is probably underinvesting in overseas investment today. I suspect one of the things that makes President Xi most nervous are the risks that come from capital account liberalisation. And yet without that, we're unlikely to see Chinese investment in the way that we could across that area. So my suspicion is that over the next 10 to 20 years, perhaps, we're going to continue to see quite an insular politics in the United States. I think the politics that led to the election of President Trump do rest on the economics of Middle America, and I can't see that changing dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years. And so I think insular pressures in America are going to persist. Europe, in its own way, is going to continue to try and look east in the same way that China is going to continue to look west. Crucially, the Gulf states will be beginning to look to the future and begin to develop a post-carbon economy in a way that encourages them to do things like privatise Saudi Aramco and impress a chunk of the proceeds into trade-enhancing infrastructure along the One Belt and One Road. And then we have new risks from President Putin's regime in a way that perhaps we didn't see clearly enough over the last 3 or 4 years. So I am optimistic about what can be achieved in Belt and Road. I am now profoundly suspicious about whether grand sweeps, grand bargains are going to make the difference. But the patient build-up, if you like, almost from the grassroots of institutions and rule-based order, I suspect could be where there is most mileage. Stop there.